Welcome everyone in another episode of SubQuery Customer Interview Series, where we discuss our customers' projects, their goals, their use cases, some technical challenges they faced, and we also learn how SubQuery helped them overcome those challenges. I'm Marta Adamczyk. I work as technology evangelist at SubQuery, and I'm the host of today's episode. And I have the most amazing guest with me, Adam Dossa. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Nice to meet you, Marta.
Great to have you here. We finally made it. That was quite hard to get on the call at the same time because we have different time zones to accommodate and busy schedules. But here we are, and I'm absolutely excited to get to know more about you, your roles, your background, and also projects that you are involved in. So Adam is a former CTO of Polymath and the head of blockchain at Polymesh. Polymesh is a blockchain designed for regulated assets, designed to solve issues with security token adoptions, governance, confidentiality, settlement, and more. And we are curious to get to know more about those projects, your roles in those projects, and also how they are related, Polymesh and Polymath. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yep, no, thanks very much for having me on. So Polymath is a Canadian company that was set up in late 2017, and I joined in early 2018. And the mission of Polymath has always been around bringing regulated securities, so things like equity and debt and so on, and real estate funds and so on, onto public blockchains. So when we first started back in early 2018, the focus initially, probably for the first 12 months or so, was on Ethereum. So we built effectively a whole bunch of smart contracts that were deployed as smart contracts onto the Ethereum network. And kind of collectively, those smart contracts allowed users to create these tokens, which had sort of compliance and some of these sort of regulatory features embedded in them.
Right.
And we pursued that path for around 12 months. We authored there's a standard called ERC 1400, which is a sort of extension of ERC 20, which is a token standard aimed at these sort of regulated or kind of compliant tokens, and that sort of seen fairly wide adoption. That was like a community effort rather than just Polymath, but we helped drive that effort. And then around a year into that, based on obviously our own experience, lots of conversations with financial kind of ecosystem entities, we kind of came to this realization that whilst Ethereum is a great blockchain and a very exciting week for Ethereum this week with the merge coming up, but it is a general purpose blockchain, right? So it's not optimized for it's not optimized for gaming, for NFTs, for DeFi, or for finance or anything else, right? It's meant to be a sort of general purpose blockchain that's trying to kind of keep everybody happy all of the time. And as a result, some of the design choices were pretty non-optimal for our very specific use case, which is regulated securities and capital markets. So we decided to build out a blockchain that was optimized just for our specific use case. And we did that. So we looked at a whole bunch of different choices and technologies that were available at that time. And we landed on using the Substrate framework, which is a framework authored by Parity or owned by Parity. It's an open source framework, which allows you to kind of build blockchains in a fairly modular way, add your own or business logic on top of the blockchain, and also make changes to the kind of core functionality, things like kind of consensus as needed. So we landed on that framework, and we've been building that out for the last 2.5 years. We had two public test nets, then an incentivized test net, and then our main net launched back in October. So we're actually probably, I think, a couple of weeks off our 1-year anniversary for Polymesh.
Congrats.
Thank you. So we'll have to have a cake or something on that date.
You should.
So the other question you asked was the kind of relationship between the Polymath company and the Polymesh, which is where I now work. So in February this year, in order to put the Polymesh blockchain on a kind of firmer regulatory footing, we created a new entity, which is the Polymesh Association, which is based out of Zug, which is a canton in Switzerland. It's a not-for-profit, so it has a mandate to effectively increase the adoption of security tokens, digital assets, obviously sort of shepherd and steward the Polymesh blockchain, and encourage the adoption, work with companies and institutions to kind of help integrate them into the blockchain and encourage adoption of the blockchain. And I think that really, Switzerland obviously has, in terms of kind of regulators, has one of the kind of clearest sets of rules around blockchains and tokens associated with them. So we were able to worked with FINMA, which is the Swiss regulator, to make sure that the PolyX token, which is the native token of Polymesh, was classed as a utility token rather than anything else. So that kind of helped put the chain on the sort of clearer regulatory backing, and particularly in our space where we work with large institutions with multiple regulators and large compliance teams, having that kind of clarity was really kind of critical. So that's why the association was set up, and also when it was set up, a whole bunch of sort of assets and personnel were moved over to that new entity.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, and like a long journey. Probably a lot of people involved, a lot of hiccups, right?
Yeah. Lots of learnings along the way, definitely.
Great. And looking back on all of this, what do you think is the biggest problem you are solving for your users with Polymesh?
So I think it's a really good question. When we designed Polymesh, and Polymesh, to be clear, it's like an evolving blockchain. We actually have a big upgrade coming, hopefully, towards the end of this month or early next month, which has a whole bunch of new features. So it's definitely like an evolving product. But in terms of some of the kind of, I suppose, USPs of Polymesh, so we've taken a kind of middle path, right? So on the one side, when you talk to a lot of you could say traditional institutions, larger banks, larger exchanges, and so on and so forth, they have understandable sort of reticence or you could say kind of concerns around using public blockchains, things like privacy, and there's a whole bunch of other, let's say, concerns around using some of the larger public blockchains. So with Polymesh, we took a sort of middle path where Polymesh is a public blockchain, so anyone can run a node, anyone can inspect the transactions, make sure that the transactions are following the kind of established rules of the blockchain. But there are certain roles within the blockchain which are permissioned. So, for example, in order to be a validator on the network that we call operators, you have to be a financially regulated entity, so something like a bank or an exchange or a transfer agent or a custodian. So rather than anyone being able to run a validator node, and anyone can obviously mean, for example, someone in a sanctioned jurisdiction, which obviously offers kind of concerns for large institutions. Instead of that being the case, that's one of the permissioned roles. Another kind of permissioned aspect of Polymesh is that every user on the chain, and this is unusual, and it's definitely there are trade-offs with this approach, but every user on the chain has to go through a very light identity verification process that we call CDD, or customer due diligence. And until you've kind of gone through that process, you can't hold PolyX, which is the native token on the blockchain, and you can't submit transactions to the chain. So all of this, I think there's sort of two aspects. One is that one of the nice things about Substrate is it does let you make these types of changes at the kind of core level of the blockchain, which is great. And the reason we've obviously put those in place is that was based on, we spent a lot of time talking to regulators and large banks, large exchanges, custodians, and so on, who are all really excited and keen to get into the digital asset space. But on the one hand, they want to be at the sort of forefront of innovation, and on the other hand, they have large compliance teams who sort of pulling them in the other direction. And these companies have a lot at risk, right? They have brand risk. Regulators obviously are very happy to hand out fines if they find one of the concerns. I don't want to overplay this, but one of the concerns that was mentioned several times is that on a public blockchain, if you're running a validator node on a public blockchain and you receive a transaction fee, you don't really know if that transaction fee has come from somebody in a sanctioned country, and that can be, there's obviously strong rules around for banks to obviously not allowed to do business or receive funds or fees from certain countries, whatever those sort of sanctioned countries are, or sanctioned individuals actually.
Right.
And there's obviously in the last 6 months or so, there's been a lot with all the kind of new raft of sanctions around the war in Ukraine and so on. There's been a lot more focus on those types of things, and it's been it's been interesting to watch the rest of the space. There was the Tornado Cash OFAC sanction that happened a few weeks ago. It's been these things are, I think, when especially for us, when we're really trying to play in this sort of regulated space, we obviously have to pay a lot of attention to those types of things and really design a solution where we feel that we can get the benefits of a public blockchain with the transparency and accessibility, alongside giving these companies the kind of assurances they need to operate on them.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about potential ways how you overcome any resistance, if there was any, when you enter a traditional finance industry with blockchain-based innovative solution. But you answered already to this question a little bit. But yeah, I think this is something that any project that is blockchain-based is facing, but especially for finance, this is crucial, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's been a great. So my background prior to Polymath, so I spent 15 years working at Morgan Stanley, which is very much in that category of large institutional kind of trading house. So I have sort of some insight. And it's been really interesting. And as I say, that these kind of companies have super smart people working at them. They're all they all have a bunch of individuals there who really see the promise and the potential of DeFi, if you like, to kind of wrap it up, right? Whether that's the sort of innovation we see around things like AMMs and these sort of liquidity pools and these different approaches to liquidity, whether it's innovation around product types and these sort of clever financial products that do things using smart contracts that really aren't possible in the traditional world. So they see all of that sort of potential. But they are, they obviously are working in these kind of, often these companies will have not just one regulator, right? But they'll have multiple regulators. They'll have entities in the US and in Europe and the UK and Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll have a lot of different kind of regulators to keep happy. And that, working through that with these companies has been, certainly it's challenging, it's interesting. Obviously, the timeline is, sometimes in the, I look with a little bit of jealousy, right? When you look at, say, a new DeFi protocol that's launched and a week later has 5 billion under management, because in the kind of like in the Wild West side of DeFi, you can kind of do that, and there's there's the sort of community that will get involved in that. But I think in our space, the timelines are much longer. These companies take a lot longer to kind of reach considered opinions. They like to take baby steps, proof of concept, or like analysis, proof of concept, MVP, and so on and so forth. So it's sort of smaller steps over a longer time frame. But but this, one of the reasons we set up the association was to kind of give let's say longevity to the chain, that the association obviously has assets to ensure that the chain has that longevity, so we can take that slightly longer term view as opposed to needing to, that sort of day by day view, which is sometimes more prevalent in the kind of DeFi side of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think most people won't expect that it can take this long for any decentralized project, but then you have to consider all of that you mentioned, and it takes time, and you have a lot of companies and institutions to contact and cooperate with. So that's for sure interesting. You've mentioned a lot about regulations and circumstances that are impacting your project and are important for you. And I wanted to know how important it is for you to, follow all the changes in regulations in terms of national level and also global and local. I know that you need to be updated. How big is this effort? And another question related with it is that I've noticed from your blog that you spend a lot of time on educating your users about local governance, local rules. And I wanted to know how important is it for you?
Yeah, so it's definitely really important. As you said, one of the aspects of like the sort of traditional financial world is that it is quite siloed into generally different geographies, but even within one country, like the US can have different rules depending on different states and so on. And there's multiple regulators, multiple kind of stakeholders involved, or with and even within one country, right, there can be multiple regulators that kind of focus on different areas. So it is, and also, needless to say, right, the blockchain space, or let's say the regulators' perspective on kind of blockchain technology has also evolved rapidly at different paces, right? But all of the regulators globally, all the big regulators are engaging with it in one form or another, maybe at different paces with different kind of points of view, but they're all engaging with it. So staying on top of that is complex and is kind of time consuming. And it's my focus is more on the technology side, but we have other people in the team who sort of spend their time more pouring through these like 50-page lists from various regulators, which is just a kind of good way to get to sleep in the evening sometimes. But so it is time consuming, but it is important. And we are seeing as well, there are efforts to, one of the reasons, kind of going back to the Ethereum days, one of the reasons we put together the ERC 1400 standard was to try to kind of start the conversation around what do standards look like, not on a country by country basis, but what can they look like, across borders? And one of the promises, one of the advantages of something like blockchain technology is to streamline cross-border settlement, right? So typically, cross-border settlement is complicated for the reasons we talked about. You're moving from one jurisdiction, like one kind of regulatory perimeter to another one, and that can be, that can kind of be complex. One of the advantages of blockchains is that blockchains themselves don't really recognize borders, and assets should be able to freely move between different geographies and so on. But I would say it's definitely still a work in still kind of ongoing effort, and there are, when you're dealing with like regulated securities, although sometimes sort of things, when you think of like an ERC20 token, it's super simple. You can just, you take one transaction, move it from one party to another. In the regulated space, you often have transfer agents involved. You have to apply like compliance rules, make sure that everyone's been KYC'd and is valid. You have custodians, so some digital assets or some assets in general require you to use a custodian, so you can't necessarily control it yourself. You have to sort of delegate control to a third party. So we're working with like there are some custodians who are sort of moving into the digital space. So there's a lot more stakeholders involved, and so it can be kind of complicated, sort of trying to put that picture together and bring all those pieces together. And what one of the kind of main efforts of the association is to work. So we have a grant program. We call it the EDF, stands for Ecosystem Development Fund. So we have a kind of grant program to help some of these companies integrate with the chain so they can offer, for example, custodian services or transfer agent services or exchanges and so on. And that working with these companies to integrate is a large part of what we do.
Well, it's so complex that it's hard to comprehend. And there is, I bet there is a lot of data that you need to index, right? And I'm curious, what is your experience with SubQuery? Because I know that you've been working with us closely for some time already and had a lot of success, and I would like to get to know your insights.
Yeah, so we've worked with SubQuery since our incentivized testnet. So I think that was around the middle of last year, maybe slightly earlier, maybe March, April last year or something. And we had another indexing solution, which I won't mention by name before that, which we weren't very happy with. And our developer team went out to the market and had a look. And with these sort of things, you're always faced with a few options. One is to build it in-house. We should kind of put resources on trying to build it in-house. And the other is obviously to try to find a well-maintained, strong kind of community-driven project and adopt that instead. And obviously that's that was the decision we made. And obviously SubQuery was that project. So we've been working with it for a long time. Exactly as you say, data indexing or data querying and so on is like critical. I mean, I think it's critical probably across all these different use cases, but one of the kind of requirements often in the regulated space is regulatory reporting, right? So regulators want, ideally well, in fact, in the traditional world, it's not real time. It's often done periodically, like every month, every 6 months, every 12 months. But again, one of the advantages of using a blockchain is you have a sort of single source of truth and you can do reporting effectively in real time or kind of close to real time. That's one of the big advantages, and regulatory reporting is kind of critical. So I think, as I'm sure right, as the viewers know, blockchains are not optimized really for querying data, right?
No, they're not.
By their nature, right? It's a whole bunch of blocks. And if you want to know what happened, a year ago or whatever, or 6 months ago, you have to kind of look through this whole chain of data, and it can be very kind of complex, particularly with historical data, right? Like current data is sort of easier to query, but historical data, it can be quite hard and slow to get hold of. So obviously the big problem for us that SubQuery solves is to solve that particular problem, make that data available, in indexed, easily queryable form, and then we use that. We use it in a bunch of places. We have an SDK that sort of wraps up all the functionality to do with the chain, and the SDK, when you're sort of initializing it, takes a SubQuery endpoint effectively. And then under the covers, we'll use that endpoint, where appropriate, right, depending on whatever the user is trying to do. So we use it there. We use it in some of our UIs just to surface things like historical data, historical transactions, and various other sort of useful data that's useful to surface to users. So it's been a great project to kind of give those types of functionality, and lots of the people we're integrating with, exactly need that sort of functionality.
Well, we are happy to be of any use and help for you, so that's great. And was it hard to start working with SubQuery for your team?
So definitely we've sort of I mean it's been an ongoing process, and we're still there's still some there are some kind of complexities to dealing with SubQuery. I think some of that complexity is to do with the way we use it and the way we're trying to index data, right? So sort of join together different bits of data that make sense to join and so on. So yeah, I think the documentation is good. Obviously, your team, or the SubQuery team, have been on hand as well. We have a Telegram with the team, and our developers often ask questions and post issues and so on as needed. So that's been helpful to have. So yeah, I think it's been a great experience. I'd be lying if I said there were definitely hurdles along the way, right, or sort of issues we've had to sort of work with you guys to help understand along the way. And I think also SubQuery as a product as well has evolved, right? So
of course,
so it's a relatively relatively actively developed space. And I suppose one of the challenges for SubQuery is that you're not you're obviously trying to provide like a generalized solution right across all substrate chains effectively, and that can be tricky because although although substrate chains often share a lot of commonality, right? The whole purpose is that they aren't all exactly the same, right? But they all have their own sort of spin on things.
And we also expand beyond substrate based chains. So yeah. So
that makes it even harder.
it makes it harder. But at the same time, it's so rewarding to be able to reach out to different ecosystems, different teams, and help others to build their projects in a more efficient and faster way. It's definitely challenging, and but yeah, we are doing it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think the other aspect, I suppose, is that Substrate itself is rapidly evolving, right? So they have monthly releases, and you probably have a bunch of different chains on different monthly releases. You obviously have the Polkadot Kusama ones, which are sort of I guess like the kind of the large projects, but then projects like Polymesh on different stages.
Yeah, our dev team is busy.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm sure they have their work cut out for them. But yeah, as I say, given all of that, so we use it heavily in production. We rarely have outages. I think most of the complexity for us comes around when we're doing upgrades. So, so as I mentioned at the start of the call, we're in the process of doing a large upgrade at the moment, and that can sometimes be, especially like if our types change, our data changes, that can be a tricky thing for any indexer, because you kind of have you're indexing some block, you suddenly have to start indexing in a different way. So those sort of challenges are definitely ones we're still working through, and I think we're working with your team on some of those kind of questions.
Well, I think it's all ongoing effort, and we should expect that, every day, every week we'll have something to do. So that's just our reality. It's like continuous work. I would wrap up with a question. If you have any advice for those who are entering blockchain now.
This is a question I've been asked a few times before. I'd say a few things. I think one is that I think it's a great industry. I think if you want to be working on the kind of cutting edge of technology, of maths, of economics, of game theory, blockchain is a great space. Clearly, reputationally, the blockchain has pros and cons, right? It would be, there obviously is a lot of really interesting work that goes on in the space. There's also a lot of scams. There's a lot of, stuff which is, let's say, more exploitative or maybe less sort of socially useful. And I think, recognizing that is important. But, I think there's often this sort of tendency in the media to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Where you kind of just focus on the scams, maybe because that's sort of like the more interesting headlines, and ignore the fact that there's a huge amount of really interesting stuff. Whether it's to do with one of the areas we're focused on at the moment is confidentiality, zero knowledge proofs, and all this stuff, which is kind of cutting edge math, super interesting, has applications outside of blockchain, sort of more generally kind of cryptographic thing. So in terms of advice, I think first of all, I think it's a great industry to be in. My general advice is, especially if you're a more sort of junior or younger developer, get involved. There's a lot of open source projects. Things like SubQuery are open source, Polymesh is open source. All of the code is developed out in the open. Often there are sort of small issues. You can make contributions. You can start building up a kind of. When we interview, one of the first things we ask for is a GitHub profile. And although, obviously, if you're working at a private company, that might not be possible. It's always great to see people who've engaged with open source projects, who've made contributions, however sort of small and big. So that's good. Go to conferences, which are now starting up in real life again, hopefully this year. Meet people, network. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there, and in some ways, I think it's one of the easiest. If you're enthusiastic, it's probably one of the easiest spaces to kind of get involved in, relative to some other areas.
Well said. Thank you, Adam, so much. That was a great chat, very insightful. Thank you for joining us today.
And thank you very much, Marta, for having me on. Great to chat.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks.